It's been nearly 50 years since any combat was fought in the jungles of Vietnam. However, the lasting effects are far from over. The United States and Vietnam struggled to overcome barriers throughout the Vietnam War. These barriers included technological advancements, which would generate new fighting techniques in order to defend each other's political views. The Americans would inevitably need to overcome the barrier of a foreign environment that would be the dense forests of Vietnam. In the end, the North Vietnamese won, resulting in a communist nation, while the Americans paid a hefty price. Politically, things were starting to heat up with the Cold War. This would inevitably lead up to the Vietnam War. The 1964 election came and went with Lyndon B. Johnson's re-election. With the re-election, military actions intensified. Within months of the election, there were thousands of troops and billions of dollars committed to the war. It was on August 2nd of 1964 that 2 U.S. naval ships were attacked and destroyed in the Gulf of Tonkin. This would eventually result in the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which was our declaration of war. Back in 1955, President Eisenhower pledged his support of Diem and the South Vietnamese. Diem and his forces named the Communist Vietnamese the Viet Cong. Some 100,000 Viet Cong were arrested, and many of them were brutally tortured and executed. The Tet Offensive was a sneak attack on the Vietnamese holiday Tet. On January 31st, everyone had agreed to the traditional ceasefire because of the holiday, but the North Vietnamese used it as a time for an ambush to catch everyone off guard. The North then attacked about 100 cities and U.S. bases. The plan backfired, however, as the United States launched an unexpected attack and stopped them. The U.S. had only 250 casualties, while the Vietnamese suffered 10,000. Short-term effects of this war was that there were 58,000 U.S. troops killed and 300,000 injured. The war also ended up setting the U.S. $200 billion back. The government needed a way to get funds to pay for it. Since President Johnson didn't raise taxes to pay for the war, there was a long cycle of inflation after. Perhaps one positive long-term effect was the lowering of the voting age to 18. A negative effect was the psychological impact that the war played on soldiers. Post-traumatic stress disorder has affected men and women involved in Vietnam for decades. According to verywellmind.com, approximately 30% of men and 20% of women have had PTSD at some point in their life. The study found that veterans would still have problems even 30 years after the war ended. Short-term effects in Vietnam, where the North killed thousands of people in South Vietnam. Long-term effects in Vietnam were from the chemicals used. They still cause birth defects. Some of the technologies and weapons used during the Vietnam War did, however, cause environmental issues. Some examples were Agent Orange or napalm. They were heavily used to destroy areas and stop guerrilla warfare tactics. These were a chemical mix that were herbicides used to kill vegetation that soldiers would use as cover. The napalm was a chemical that burned similarly to gasoline. Over 73 million liters of chemicals were used to kill vegetation in Vietnam. Due to these chemicals, many soldiers and citizens suffered from cancer and birth defects. Tens of thousands of kids born in the generation after the war had birth defects. Also, an estimated 2.1 to 4.8 million Vietnamese people were exposed to the Agent Orange chemical. Aside from using chemicals, the U.S. would also bring in large tractors and artillery in order to clear out forests. What was it like fighting in the jungles? How did you have to adapt to the environment and your surroundings?
Different types of jungles. You had single canopy, double canopy, triple canopy. The triple canopy was hard to move in and hard to get anything done in because you couldn't hardly see more than 10, 15 yards. The double and the single canopy, you adapted with that because you could see. You were very careful in your movements. Your observation had to be on top of everything because you never knew where there was booby trap or where they were hiding, but you had a better chance of seeing them.
The The U.S. made the M16 rifle and later redesigned it in 1966 to perform better in wet and dirty conditions. These conditions were a common sight during jungle warfare. It quickly became one of the most commonly used weapons throughout the Vietnam War. The Bell UH-1, also known as the Huey, was a game changer. Not only was it used as a gunship, but it could also transport casualties because of its ability to quickly land and take flight. Over the course of the war, over 4,000 of the helicopters were destroyed, making it the most downed aircraft in Vietnam. Other popular weaponry was the M48 tank, which was capable of traveling 30 miles per hour. However, the swampy terrains of Vietnam made it very challenging to use. As a result, they used more heavy artillery. One man who must not be forgotten is General Westmoreland. He served as an artillery officer during World War II. He later on became commander of the Military Assistance Command in Vietnam. One of his most notable quotes was, "I do not believe that the men who served in uniform in Vietnam have been given the credit they deserve." It was a difficult war against an unorthodox enemy. Another technology included TV broadcasting. This caused a large amount of public outcry because it posted the number of deaths. Furthermore, Americans would hold marches to protest the war. Another barrier was created for the soldiers when they returned home, as the media portrayed them as monsters. Chemical warfare played a vital role at the time. Technologies like Agent Orange, a poisonous gas, were dropped on places to kill and destroy areas. Throughout the war, over 20 million gallons of Agent Orange were sprayed across 4.5 million acres of land. Another strategy was napalm. Napalm is a jelly-like substance that burns like gas. Interesting enough, napalm originated at the University of Harvard. 1942 held the first field test of napalm. Napalm was born a hero, but lives a pariah, said attorney Robert M. Neer. Its impressive 5,000-degree temperature burnt skin down to the bone and was also used to destroy areas. It was very effective because of its ability to spread. These technologies were used to combat the barrier of fierce jungles in Vietnam. A strategy for the North was tunnels. Tunnels gave the North Vietnamese the upper hand. Viet Cong soldiers would use the tunnels during combat to hide. The tunnels also served as communication, supply routes, and even living quarters. This tactic became known as guerrilla warfare. In order to fight against this, the United States used tunnel rats. Tunnel rats were American and Australian soldiers. They underwent search and destroy missions behind enemy lines. It was a very dangerous job, and about 33% of them died. One of the most dangerous and effective technologies for the Vietnamese side was booby traps. They created yet another barrier for the Americans to conquer. While the Vietnamese had been fighting in the jungles for hundreds of years, the Americans had to adapt and overcome the barrier of a new surrounding. Booby traps littered the forests, and Americans had to watch their every step. The Vietnamese were quite ingenious with designs and placements.
What sorts of traps did you have to, or what sorts of traps did you see when you were over there?
How did you handle them?
Okay, booby traps. They were very ingenious with booby traps. We saw tiger pits with stakes in the bottom of them, punji pits with feces spread on the punjies where you stepped in it. Not only would you step on the punji stakes, but there was like a cat's jaw that came in ankle above height, and they would drive into both your ankles on both sides, and made it very hard to get out of. The feces, of course, was to spread contamination and infection. They had whip booby traps where you tripped a tripwire, and a branch that they had pulled back would come out and had stakes on it that would hit your stomach or chest level. They had swing traps. You'd be driven into a panel with spikes in it. Tripwires with hand grenades. They had a bullet round and a little piece of bamboo over a piece of wood with a nail in it. When you stepped on it, it would trigger the round and come up through your feet.
In conclusion, both the United States and the Vietnamese had to overcome advancements in new technologies and conquer environmental issues. This was necessary as new fighting styles and new weapons revolutionized the way war was fought. Lastly, the two countries had to overcome the political problems they had with each other, as well as the problems they faced within their own country. These were barriers that were broken during the Vietnam War.